IVM.
The Constitution of India was kidnapped. So said our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. Addressing Parliament in the summer of 1951, he said, "We live in a haunted age. I don't know how many members have the sense of ghosts and apparitions surrounding us, ideas, passions, hatred, violence, preparations for war, which are more dangerous than other things." And so moved the motion for the first amendment to our constitution. But it was just 16 months since the constitution had been debated, discussed, argued, and adopted by pretty much the same group of people. So, what was going on? Hello and welcome to the longest constitution. My name is Priya Mirza, and this podcast is about the Constitution of India and how it shapes the terrain of our lives. And by now, you know that this is what we do. We look at people, laws, and how the Constitution is a guiding light in people figuring out their stuff. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but even when it doesn't, we know that it hasn't. And that's the way the Constitution works as a bar, a measure of how we have failed and struggled, but haven't given up. Yeah. Okay, so let's get going. In today's show, we are looking at the First Amendment. We're also looking at institutional inventions along the way, the PIL, that's public interest litigation, as well as carrying on with our excavation of the constitutional history of free speech in independent India. So put on your gloves, wear your solar topi, get your pickaxes, and let's get digging. Our first story today is set in 1975. The city is Bombay, and the government of Maharashtra is charged with corruption by Pilu Modi, an architect and member of parliament who was also president of the Swatantra Party and incidentally studied at Doon School and later studied architecture at Berkeley. And his roommate was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who later went on to become Pakistan's prime minister. And when Bhutto was executed, Modi wrote a book, Zulfi, My Friend. Friends, the people who never let us go. Cheers to that. Anyway, Modi headed the Swatantra Party, which was a political party. And just to raise a few questions, what are political parties? Who funds them and what are the laws which regulate them? We will be coming to that in the coming up episodes, but let's focus for the moment on this case about the PIL. By the way, the constitution itself has no provisions for a PIL. But here, Pilu Modi and Mrinal Gore, who was a member of the Maharashtra Legislative Assembly, both of them residents of Bombay, were concerned about stuff happening in their city. Like the fact that the chief minister, VP Nayak, was part of a land scam and had allotted prime real estate to his favorite builders in a secretive manner at an undervalued price. Ooh, the making of a Netflix series. But the legal question was that neither Modi or Gore were actually involved in this. And just as residents of Bombay, did they have a locus standi? Did they have a legal standing in this dispute? That's what locus standi essentially means. So if you are not an affected party, can you still petition court? And this is what the judge in the Back Bay case, as it is called, Justice Jayanti Lal Gandhi, had to consider. And with that, we can look at the making of the First Amendment. So we have looked at 3 cases so far, all in 1950. Ramesh Thapar versus State of Madras, 1950. Brij Bhushan versus State of Delhi, 1950. Shaila Bala Devi versus Secretary of Bihar, 1950. And all these are closely related to the movement of the First Amendment to our Constitution, passed in the summer of 1951. All 3 are examples of how the courts were tilted towards granting the individual freedom of expression. All 3 favored the petitioner's freedom of expression. All 3 restricted the state's attempt to curb their freedom. And in one of them, the court observed that preaching murder was in fact part of a citizen's right to freedom of expression. And these were landmark judgments. So think about it. In the 16 months that the Constitution had been enacted, there was chaos about the exact extent and limits of the fundamental rights to equality, property, and freedom of speech and expression. And at the same time, in those years, there were open fears of the consequences of hate speech, the preaching of war, widespread hatred, animosity, alongside communal violence and riots. And it was this, amongst other litigation over social justice and property, that led to Nehru's government passing the First Amendment with the objective to restrict the fundamental right to expression. And with that, we go to our third story today, carrying on our journey of tracking the freedom of press. It is the late 1950s, and the government, in an attempt to curb the monopoly of a few newspapers, decided to fix the prices of newspapers along with the number of pages as well as the space they could allot to advertisements. And this was under the Newspaper Act of 1956 and the Daily Newspaper Order of 1960. That's like Instagram regulating how many pictures we can post. Okay, just a second. That's not the best analogy because Instagram is not the state and is not obliged to uphold political rights. But yeah, the analogy of a platform to express is just about right. And most importantly, newspapers provide information, informing citizens, and at the same time are running a business, both constitutional rights. Now, these government orders were challenged by a Pune-based newspaper called Sakal under Article 19, Part 1, Part A of the Constitution, and they argue that either they would have to raise their prices if they wish to keep their size constant and lose circulation, or they would have to reduce their size and thus provide less news than they wish to. In either event, their free speech rights were violated. Meanwhile, the First Amendment, often called a mini constitution in itself, was passed amidst great acrimony, with independent MPs like H.N. Kunzru and Ram Narayan Singh, and opposition figures like Hussain Imam, plus congressmen like Deshbandhu Gupta and H.V. Kamath openly objecting to the amendment bill. Kamath, by the way, called it midsummer madness. But after many debates, on 2nd June 1951, with 228 ayes and 20 noes and a large number of abstentions, the First Amendment was passed and added the following grounds of restrictions on the freedom of speech and expression. The first, the security of the state. The second, friendly relations with foreign states. And finally, public order. So, in addition to libel, slander, defamation, contempt of court, decency, or morality of the state, now there were more grounds under which the state could limit the freedom of expression. So, just as a reminder, the amendment also inserted sections into two other fundamental rights, Article 15 and Article 31. That's the contentious fundamental right to property. But, oh God, I'm running out of time. And we will look into this in the coming up episodes. But for now, in Sakal Papers versus Union of India 1961, the Supreme Court held that these newspaper regulations were not constitutional and struck them down. And that permissible restrictions under Article 19, Part 2 were limited to public order, decency, and morality, and did not cover the government's unfair competition argument. And finally, in the Back Bay case, Justice Gandhi dictated his oral judgment, which ran into 953 pages, and said that the ministers were indeed responsible for reckless negligence in allotting plots and admitted the petition. Yeah. So today's takeaways are: our First Amendment substantially restricted Article 19 and included new grounds under which the state could regulate free speech. And constitutions, by the way, like all texts, are a reflection of their times. The second, the Back Bay case was one of the earliest cases where the court allowed citizens to raise important constitutional questions and pushed aside the technical plea of locus standi as an obstruction to such petitions. And finally, the Sakal Papers demonstrated that the permissible restrictions under Article 19, Part 2 did not include the government controlling a monopoly and upheld the right to freedom of expression. I hope you like the show. If you have questions or comments, please send them in on Twitter, where I tweet at FundamentallyP, or on Instagram, The Longest Constitution. Until next time, this is me, Priya Mirza, signing out.
there's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
Hello, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcasts Network. On The Habit Coach, Dr. Richa and Ashton talk about the ill effects of cigarettes, vapes, and hookahs. On Misconduct, Raghavi and Nisha introduce us to Sarlaben, the woman who led the Chipko movement. On Naan Curry, Sadaf and Archit talk about the tearjerker of all vegetables, onions. On Pulyabazi, Pranay and Saurabh analyze whether Indian states should engage in economic diplomacy. And on Ek Chuski Finance, Priyanka tells us all there is to know about KYC. We've got some exciting news for you. IVM Podcasts has just launched its merch and our first line is out now. Head to the IVM Podcasts website and click on the shop tab to check out our first collection of t-shirts. Do follow us on social media. We are IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any platform you're listening on. And you can also check us out on YouTube. We're also doing a small listener survey to better understand how you respond to our shows and advertising on the network. We would really appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to fill it out. It helps us build better shows for you. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors this week: SBI Life Insurance, Jupiter, a digital banking app, Capgemini, get the future you want, Intel V Pro, built for business, and Intel, future banao wonderful with Intel powered laptops.